coilover install on a Mercedes W210. So these are from a brand called PB Coilovers, and they're not true coilovers. They just have these adjustable spring pads on top of the spring. So I'll show you how to install them today. So these are the tools that I used for this job. So I had a hammer, a small one and a big one, flashlight. I used 2 1/4-inch ratchets and about 4 3/4 inch ratchets. 8mm socket, Torx T20, 5mm Allen, 2 16mm sockets, 2 18mm sockets, 2 19mm sockets, and a 22mm socket. Had 2 extensions, one kind of short, one kind of long. I used a caliper, adjustable vice grip, punch, and this is the best tool to have for the shocks is the swivel ratcheting wrench, mainly a 17, so this is 17 and a 19. Pry bar, and of course you need the Mercedes Spring Compressor and a impact gun with 17 to take the wheels off. So I'll post a link in the description for aftermarket one. This factory spring compressor is pretty expensive. Alright, the first step before you can put the car in the air is to unbolt the shocks. So we'll just take this cover off, and we'll need to hold the shock. I'm going to be using an adjustable vice grip to hold it, and then we'll unbolt the nut. Alright, because of the awkward angle, you really should be using a swivel ratcheting wrench like this. So it's a 17mm nut, and on the other side there's even less access, so this will really help out. After the front shocks are unbolted, we will need to do the rear, and for the rear we are going to take out the trunk carpeting. So we'll have to remove the centerpiece and these 2 sides to access the shock bolts. So with that centerpiece removed, you'll need a Torx T20 to unbolt these. But we actually do not need to remove the side pieces, we just need to remove the center to gain access to the shock bolts. So same thing as the front, we gotta hold it down with that vise and then a 17mm nut, and it'll come right out. Alright, so with all 4 shocks unbolted, we are now ready to go up in the air. So right now would be a time to loosen your lug bolts for your wheels if you don't have an impact. But the reason why we have to unbolt the shocks is obviously we're replacing them, but this gives us more suspension droop so we can take the spring out easier. With the car in the air, we can see how much more travel we get with the shocks unbolted. This will definitely help out taking the spring. Alright, so with the car in the air, we'll see the spring and shock, which we'll have to take out. So first I'll take the spring out, and we'll need a special tool for that. So this is a special tool we need to remove the spring. This is a Mercedes Spring Compressor. It's a telescoping type, and this is the only type you should use on these type of springs. So we'll see this is the top one because it's indexed, and this is the bottom one, which will automatically catch on the compressor. Alright, so the way that you use the spring compressor is you'll put one of these pancakes up here and then get it as high as you can. So right about there is good, and pay attention to the orientation because you'll have to have the bottom one facing the opposite direction. So because the top one is facing like this, we'll have to have this one facing the opposite way like that. And that will go right there. Alright, so we'll see we have the compressor lashed on the top, and we'll need to get a 19mm and tighten it up, and it will just compress the spring. This is how much you'll have to compress the spring before it's able to come out. So that's quite a bit. This spring is pretty big when it's decompressed. So we'll see that this spring fully compressed is about the size of the coilover springs uncompressed. So that was quite a bit. And also never use an impact with this type of spring compressor. It is very dangerous. Alright, next step is setting the height for the coilovers. So we're going to grab our spanners and loosen them, and then we can adjust where we want it. So I'll set it to where I want it and I'll show you where it's at. or using a caliper to measure where the top of the collar is to the top of the adjuster, we're at 17.88 millimeters. So I'll match that on both sides of the front, and I'll adjust the rear accordingly. Alright, here is the spring installed, and the height I set it at is the absolute highest you can go without having to unbolt the control arm to stick it in. So I was able to just barely squeeze it in there while putting pressure down on the control arm. So that is just my little PSA. But next up, we're going to remove the shock. So the shock is held in by a 16mm bolt and a 16mm nut. So we'll remove that next. Alright, with the shocks removed, ready to replace them. So these are specific front to rear, and they are labeled. The sticker came off, but this is the front. They do look identical. So we'll just have to snake it in here. It's a little tight on space, but it's not too bad. So what I ended up having to do is to jack up the control arm from right here just a little bit so that I can gain a little bit more access to the top. And now it's in. So now I'll reinstall the hardware, and then we'll be done with the front. Alright, so there's one more piece we have to do. So once the spring is in, I have to put the top bolt in for the adjustable spring pad. So if we go look on the other side, we'll see that is how it is inserted. It's a 22mm bolt. So it sits flush with the spring perch, and it holds the adjuster in place. So this is what it looks like off the car. So all we gotta do is sit it in place and line up the bolt hole and bolt it down. Alright, the fronts are now done since we got that secured. So all we have to do is bolt up the shock, but that will be done once we lower the car on all four wheels. But here's how it looks. So that was not too bad. It probably took me about 2 hours. I was going pretty slow. But the hardest part is just getting the spring in. Everything else is pretty easy. So now we'll move on to the rears. Alright, the rears are much easier. We don't even use spring compressor. So we're going to start off by taking off these 8mm bolts for these lower control arm covers. So there's one right there and one right there, and that's on both sides. So we'll start with that. Alright, so before we unbolt the control arm, we got to unbolt the shock. So that's two 16s just like the front, and once that's removed, it's two 18s for the lower control arm. I'm going to have to support it from here. So we're going to unbolt it and keep it supported, remove the bolt, and then lower the jack slowly, and the spring and shock will just come out. See, you got to hold it with the 18 there, and the shock is two 16s. Alright, so all that we did was support the control arm here, take the bolt off, and lower it slowly, and the spring and the shock came out really easily. So that's the best way to do this. Alright, so for the rear spring adjusters, the height I'm going to set it to about 17.5 millimeters. So the rears are a little different because you're going to have to reuse whatever spring pad your car came with, and this car has ones on it, so this is the lowest one. So it'll be different for everybody, but if you want to match the height I'm doing, it's 17.5 in the rear. Alright, here's how I have the rear spring set up. So this actually can move around. It's loose. But you'll see it aligns with the lower control arm there, and we reuse the spring pad, and the shock just bolts in the same. So now we'll do the other side. So 18mm here, 16 there, and we'll lower it down. No spring compressor required. Alright, both sides are done. Got the lower control arm cover on, and that's it. This is way easier than the front. That only probably took me an hour. Alright, the last step is to put the car back on the ground, the wheels, and to tighten up the shocks. So what you'll need is to, with these shocks, you need a 5mm Allen to hold the shaft of the shock into place, and that is a 17mm bolt. And just tighten those down, and we're done. All right, and that's it. So coilovers are installed. Here's the initial height. So it will settle some, but not too much. But I think I got it where I want it to be, not too low. So we'll take it out and see how it looks. So here it is, stock height. So here's the car after its initial test drive. Settled a little bit in front, a little bit in the rear. She looks good. A little bit lower than stock, but not too low. All right, so here's the car after a little test drive, and the springs have settled a little bit more. So this should be pretty close to where the final ride height is. So these springs were used before, so they've already been settled. But if you have new springs, they will lower some more after some time. But I'm pretty happy with the height. I mean, they do go a lot lower than this, but I think this is a usable height if you drive your car more often, or the roads are bad where you live. But we're pretty good. So you'll probably notice the front looks like it has just a little bit more gap than the rear, and that is because the fender arches on W210 are uneven front to back. So when you measure it from the frame, you're actually leveled to the ground. But if the fender gaps were even front and rear, the front would be lower to the ground than the rear. So that is why I went with that height. So on the test drive, I heard no rubbing, so it's not too low. I think it looks really good. It's a nice usable height. And I had it on softer settings and actually rode better than it did with the stock shocks, which are probably worn out. So I think the car looks great. This is probably very close to what the AMG Euro springs are, maybe just a little bit lower. But yeah, I think it looks great. You can actually adjust the length of the shocks. So they're pretty much where the stock ones are at, and it's just enough suspension travel for this height. So if you go lower, you should decrease the travel, but I didn't have to because I'm not that low. And you have 30-way dampening adjustment. So right now I have it on the softest setting, and it rides really good. So if you daily drive your car, you may want to have it on the softer setting. You have 30 clicks of adjustability, so you can go pretty stiff. And adjusting the shocks will not affect the height of the car or the alignment. And speaking of alignment, once you lower your car, you should get aligned. So this car definitely needs it. So here's a little close-up of the wheel gaps. So we got about 1 finger gap in the rear, and a little bit over 1, close to 2 in the front. But when you look from the side, from the frame, it is level, which is my preferred stance. And as you saw, we could go much lower if we wanted to. The spring adjusters are not maxed out at all. And if we look, the front bumper is not super low either. So I think this is a very realistic, real-world height. So, I mean, you'll still need to be careful. It is lowered, but it's not like you're going to be scraping on everything. So these coilovers are made by a company called PB Brakes. They are about $1,200 US delivered. So this is a good mid-range coilover for this car. KWs are more, and BC Racing also makes them now too for a similar price. So I think these are great coilovers because they're very comfortable too. But I've heard great things about the BC as well. Obviously the KW is the best one to get, but that is also almost 2 to 3 times more than these. So I think this is a good mid-range coilover to get. They're not the cheapest ones out there. They're not the most expensive either. I like the 30-way adjustable dampening, so you got plenty of room to play with. And me personally, if I'm just driving around daily, the softest setting is my preferred. But if you go up the canyons or track the car, going stiffers, it actually does make a big difference. So really happy with how these coilovers perform. I hope you found the video helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them below. And thank you for watching.